Good evening, everyone. And Jonathan has co-opted me to give a rendition and discussion and sharing on Judges Aphorisms 31. And so since the title is on karma, we just wanted to say a few introductory remarks, maybe 15 minutes or so about karma, and then really let everyone here, put in their thoughts, their ideas, even their questions in regards to karma, because it is considered to be the one thing that would essentially save the world. So, it's a worthy topic of investigation. The beginning for me in regards to karma has to do with the fact that there's only one life, one truth, one reality. And everything has to be derivable from that. Everything has got to be derived in a linear or alternative way from that source. And so what the secret doctrine shares with us is that from this one unknowable, to make it simple, and we can always have, again, questions and discussions or queries about that. From this one unknowable, nothing directly comes, yet it must be responsible for everything. And so it is not responsible in the totality of its boundlessness for this, but what she tells us is that the one thing that is coeval with it always is law. And she describes law in the Key to Theosophy, I think around 201, as a universal ultimate law, which is called karma, that is the fountain and origin as well as source of every other law. And so from something that we can't conceive, we are now teetering on something that we can conceive, although the field within we are conceiving it will determine how we understand it. And so if we take that field that she gives us in the SD as the first one, which is different than the unknowable, what we can understand of law is that it expresses itself in short form as those three logoic forces / intelligences that were referred to last week. The first logos, which is unmanifest, the second and the third. These three combined in a way in terms of their interactions in time and space, although they are one thing in their source, they combine to create, HPB tells us, the germ of all things. So from the absoluteness, we conceive of a first one in which law becomes active, and the activity of that law expresses itself as the three logi. If we refer back to the SD, one way of thinking about, and this is all conceptual so that it cannot be truth in terms of words. Throw the words out after you have the ideas, because none of that really becomes important. But those three logi can be seen as bare subjectivity, pre-cosmic ideation, and pre-cosmic substance. Those three things interacting together, creating that germ, or we should say creatively manifesting that germ that gives rise to that Brahmanic field, i.e. that third logos in manifestation, then becomes the prototype, in a sense, for all aspects of Trinity. We're talking about the absolute, the first one, the law. We're talking about the three logi. Now we're talking about Brahma as being the summation of all possible wisdom, or the Ishwaric state that gives rise to eventually the distinct wisdoms that are called prajna. And these then become the model for what she tells us in the Secret Doctrine in the introduction to the Proem, the third expression or the emergence of the monads from that pre-state, i.e. first sloka, second stanza, third, or first stanza, second stanza, third stanza. And these three can be understood when we put all of this together as the foundation and expression of the three fundamental propositions that we always present in all of our teachings, all of the classes, all of the basis for understanding. And yet the interesting thing is, if there is only deity and there is only law, and this deity and this law gives rise to all of these other things that become solidified metaphorically within that monad, and we understand that monad to be truly a representation of the three fundamentals, deity, law, and the force of law in action as the transformative substance through which that which is immortal works, then we realize that we are those three fundamentals. We are those three loci. We are that Brahmanic force and field. We are the drop that rests on the ocean and assimilates that ocean in various degrees. And HPB calls this, again, in a reference in the Key to Theosophy, the ultimate root of noumena that is the basis of all being. And so this is the basis of the root of what we are. And as a result of that, we cannot speak of karma as separate from ourselves, as acting on ourselves, but only through ourselves. So when we accept that responsibility, we are our own expression of karma. And as the macrocosm reflects the microcosm and the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, there is an interaction between that macrocosmic idea of karma and that microcosmic idea of karma. So if we use that as a base, there is nothing that we can ever say is happening to us other than what we've done to ourselves and for ourselves as ourselves.
A theory.
And that would also then agree to the field of life within which we act. The second point that we want to talk about is what are the specifics of karma? And these are just ideas that all of you have already heard. They are said so many times that we probably redundantly express them without giving thought to them. Karma is action. But we don't really think about what action is and how it relates to succession. Karma is action and its own reaction. Karma is, based on what we've understood, life itself. Karma is the ultimate fount, as she tells us again in the key, of all laws. Karma is the moral law of compensation. Karma is a progressive law that, when properly understood, is the basis for spiritual evolution. Karma can be seen as reward and punishment, and yet there is absolutely no reward or punishment. There is only action and reaction and the interpretation of that action depending upon where you are in your mind at a certain point in time. What is good today may not be good for you tomorrow, but it is the very same thing that you had yesterday that you enjoyed so much. Where does the difference come? When we talk about karma, we can talk about the cause and effect on the physical plane. We can talk about the laws on the moral plane. We can talk about how karma works vitally and literally impacts the vital forces that make up the vehicles that we use. We can talk about karma from the mental plane, and depending upon how we use the word spirituality, and spirit, we can talk about karma from the spiritual plane, but then we have to be clear that we're not talking about karma from the point of view of that ultimate Atma. Because as HPB said, karma is the working aspect thereof. And so these are all terms that each and every one of them give rise to essays upon essays about how karma does what it does and what karma is. The third point that we want to bring up is that when we want to really tackle karma in light of what we said first, i.e., we are the three fundamentals, there are only those three truths, law is inherent within the very fabric of the universe. It is pre-time as well as involved in time. It is essentially the cause of space, time, and dimensionality. And so when we have all of these ideas on the table, what we need is something to help us shift through them. And so this other phrase that everyone has heard is a phrase of terms that we should bring to the table to look at karma. Who, what, where, how, when, I-ness, motive, conditionality, relativity. When we bring those ideas to the table to understand karma, now we're beginning to look at its insides. As Judge says, karma is hidden and karma is manifest. We can always see what's happening immediately here and now. Look around the world. The lesser evident is what are those subtle causes that make us see the world as we do? The deeper causes, if we take a jump, have to do with what are the very forces that move those causes to come into place in the first place. And these are all legitimate questions to ask about karma. The only thing that HPB says that we shouldn't do too much is look into the very essential cause of karma, because that's like trying to look into the very heart of the cause of the absolute. Why the absolute? Because again, karma and the absolute, or law and the absolute, are coeval out of space and time. Law enters into space and time to create the formative aspects of all things, as well as that subjectivity that utilizes that. The other piece that we did neglect to mention earlier on is that when we come to that Brahmanic phase that we've identified in a sense with the monadic aspect and the three fundamentals of our being, there's another little piece of the puzzle that helps. And those are the three gunas, another triad. Understanding those three gunas and the properties that they represent, those properties then generating the principles that become the great sources of our being, of our planes, of our own principles and their activity, even of the forces, then again puts another piece of information on the table that we can begin to use to understand the ideas of karma. And so when we want to move to the next phase, i.e., how do we work with karma to the point that it is no longer an obstructive force? Now HPB, as well as Judge, and the references that they sent us to, i.e., things like the Upanishads and the Puranas, tell us that there are certain ingredients that we have to take into account. And again, those ingredients are the mind principle or the mind field itself, the samskaras, which are the impressions, the vasanas, which are the forces of desire that are inherent with those impressions, the moral nature, the motive that drove that nature. We have to take into account the ideas of cause, effect, time, and space, cycles, because certain ideas will manifest in certain cycles. Again, conditionality, because certain environments are modified by conditions. And as Judge tells us, as we'll see in the aphorisms, if the conditions are not right, the karma cannot manifest. And he refers to that through the idea of instruments that are appropriate for karma to manifest at a particular time. And when we look at these elements, that also include the skandhas as different from the samskaras, how the skandhas are related to the elements themselves, how these elements are tied into, when we look at it personally, to the very DNA that we talk about very glibly nowadays in terms of scientific advancement, and how all of this relates to the environment that we are in at a particular time, not to mention the globe that we are on, not to mention the races that are on the globe at a particular time. And all we have to do is look at news nowadays, the interactions of those races as they relate to the rise and fall of different forms that the soul uses. And from a theosophical point of view, if we substitute three fundamentals for the spiritual soul, that reincarnating immortal ego, whose noumenal nature is everything that we spoke about that led up to that Brahmanic aspect of universal manifestation, then we've got a full picture of things to consider just to understand some of the operations of karma. And so one other aspect has to do with becoming free of karma as a personality. And there are certain aspects, definitely for those that have been familiar with Patanjali and those yoga aphorisms, those that are very familiar with the nature of meditation and how that relates to karma as expressed in the aphorisms and as expressed in these aphorisms tonight in different ways, will find and begin to understand the things that are important in doing what that quote says. Karma to everyone else is a stern nemesis, but to the spiritually focused individual, it is the very path to liberation. But that is not a liberation that means an escape from anything, but a liberation to become embodied for the service of humanity. So with that background, let's jump into your ideas, your questions, your thoughts, your queries about these aphorisms on karma. And for myself, what I've done to make it simpler is that I've broken the aphorisms up into semi-categories. There are 31 of them. But if you read them, you'll see that some of them talk about being, i.e. there is no karma unless there is a being. Some of them talk about the environment. Some of them talk about the instrument. Some of them talk about the types of karma. Some of them, or quite a few of them, talk about the operation of karma. And so when we look at the aphorisms themselves, we should always ask ourselves, where is this coming from? What is it bringing our attention to? And then again, with that who, what, where, how, when, why, conditions, relativity, motive, and sense of I, we can begin to create a picture for fuller understanding. Not saying that we would understand karma in its completeness, no, but it will begin to make much more sense, and we will begin to see it more than as a simple linear cause and effect, which it is definitely not. Okay, so let's just open this up. I think this is the first time in my life I've kept under my timeline. And so it's not even 8 o'clock yet, and we've got a lot of time for discussion.
That was a lot in 20 minutes. Thank you very much. No, that was a very fine thing. So you just, I think at this point, you figure out how to use that hand raising thing on your Zoom at the bottom. It's under, yeah, it says raise hand down there. And also you'll have to unmute yourself. So you all might want to consider unmuting yourselves, or at least if you plan on raising a question. And hopefully we can keep our questions a little bit concise. That way we'll be able to have, I guess, the maximum amount of people be able to participate. Jeffrey. You have to unmute.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Gene. That was great. I mean, what an incredible sort of panoramic view of karma. And so I went over the some of the aphorisms this morning at the last minute. And the first two, it starts, with that idea of it's a being, and I like your idea of categorizing the aphorisms. The next one, karma is the adjustment of effects flowing from causes. And when I read this, it struck me that it's making a distinction between karma and causality. Effects flowing from causes is causality, in just sort of the commonsensical idea. Here it's saying that karma is the adjustment, and aphorism 1 would indicate that a being is making or feeling that adjustment. There's a distinction made between the agent and the patient here in number 1. So do you, a lot of times, and Blavatsky says different things about this, and I dare say contradictory things about this in her voluminous writings. Sometimes she identifies karma with causality, and sometimes here it's saying, Judge is saying anyway, that's an adjustment of the effects of causality. Now, the highest law that you were describing is coeval with the absolute, would seem to suggest that that would be something that is beyond causality, and in certain contexts, or continually, I guess, would be adjusting the sort of regular action of causality. Is that a way of understanding karma? I'm coming in a way from a Buddhist background, where in Buddhism, karma means intentional action.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Of course, that's not what Judge is talking about, but I would like you to just comment, or other people to comment on the idea of an adjustment of causal effects rather than actual causality.
Okay, so just in a nutshell, the simplest way to look at that is really from the point of view of the human body and homeostasis. The body is always in a state of flux. It's always in a state of dysregulation based on what we do, and it is always trying to adjust that dysregulation to a state of regulation so that health ensues. Sometimes it wins, sometimes it loses. But the idea of the body embraces the idea that what gave rise to that body is more important as a cause than the body as an expression. So the body becomes a partial expression of the cause. Judge tells us that the cause and the effect are in one thing. If we take cause and effect, the only way the effect appears different than the cause is if we introduce the idea of succession.
Sure.
Succession only exists in time and space because time and space are limited. And it's there's a very interesting article in Scientific America right now. And what they are talking about, they're talking about the idea of the origins of space and time. And one of the main ideas that they have is that the universe itself as we know it is not the fundamental ground. And in that they are correct. And the fundamental ground, although that is not the ground of the absolute that we're referring to, has embedded inherent within it law. And it is again, the first one, when that boundless becomes bound, that law becomes active in terms of succession and particularization as we understand it. In other words, in order to have a form, you have to have particles. And you can't have a form with one particle, so you've got to have two. When you introduce two, now you've got a difference in terms of place and inevitably time. Now you're talking about succession. And although you're talking about one field, one cause, in which is the effect, now we're drawing it out in time and space. Mm-hmm. And so when the adept sits in the now and sees all of this simultaneously, and you and I had this discussion way back before, and I gave you the analogy of the shopping mall and everybody on the escalators, if you think carefully. And escalators going up and escalators going down, and people walking in, people walking out, and everyone thinking only of themselves in terms of cause and effect, going shopping, buying something, etc., as opposed to the one standing above, looking at all of it happening at the same time. Mm. And so the appearance of succession becomes the illusion of each observer, and yet can be seen from a higher perspective as one simultaneous moment of pure activity. And we have to shift our points of view and points of reference when we do that. And so let me kick it over to Judy and some of the others, because we may have to come double back on that. Yes, Judy?
Yes, all right, I'll try to be brief, but I just understand there are three kinds of karma in general. There would be the spiritual, and then the psychical, which would have to do with one's environment, and then the personal karma of the personality that operate on us. I get this in general from the aphorisms, but it seems that there is, in the psychical, there's a family karma. I have a friend who was a summa cum laude valedictorian, brilliant man. And in the last few months, he has Alzheimer's. And his mother was also just a fanatical Christian Scientist, and he never got any medical care until now. And, I'm just trying to be compassionate toward him. I'm not a doctor, a psychiatrist, as you are. But is there a sense in which a family karma can be operative from one parent to a child, and that might even continue with other generations? This man has no children. He never married. Mm-hmm. But how do we, in a sense, deal with someone who really doesn't understand that there is a physical plane, a psychical plane, and a spiritual one? Because he wants to give up his faith because it isn't working. I said, don't give up your faith, but you do need a doctor. Mm-hmm. So it's so sad, but I'm sure you've dealt with these cases before.
Yes, I mean, in kind of a nutshell, we are liberated by our thoughts and we are enchained by our thoughts. And our thoughts and our beliefs dictate reality more than reality is truly experienced. So we can have everything in front of us that we need as an opportunity to make improvements and changes and even heal disease. But if we don't believe in that particular system, we're not going to approach that system. Therefore, that system is not going to help us. And so once again, we are our own judges of karmic repercussion. And yet that may not have to be a bad thing. That may not have to be a punishable thing. Mm-hmm. From a perspective. The teachers tell us that there is no absolute good, there is no absolute evil. And in Einstein's universe, everything is relative, which is why we threw the word relativity in with the karma and conditionality. Because again, depending upon the circumstances that surround us and the way we view them, that idea of dementia can be a blessing, or we can understand it to be a curse. The truth is that it's the experience of the soul. And as Judge tells us in the aphorisms, whether we're talking about distributive karma, national karma, family karma, individual karma, community karma, it's all for the awakening of the soul. If we put it in Patanjali's terms, it's for the experience of the soul and the liberation of the soul. And so the real questions, perhaps, in terms of value for ourselves and compassion for those that are going through that state is, what are we learning? Is this a punishment? Is this something that the soul took on literally and consciously to experience that state from the inside out so that it could return in order to help heal that state? And so we have freedom of choice at every minute. Karma is not a fatalistic thing. And when we begin to look between the moments, so to speak, there is that freedom to choose how we want to polarize our lens of the mind for the moment to see things in an old, stagnant, habitual way or in a new way. And yet the instrument that we're using is also part of karma. So if we look at it grossly from the point of view of the three gunas, sattva, and we associate sattva with the highest, the most illuminative, the most spiritually intellectual, rajas with, I don't know, what do you want to call it, cognitive mind and desire and external experience, and tamas as the body that we've got to work. As Judge tells us, karma works itself out on different principles in different ways, sometimes all together, sometimes separately. And so he can realize, just like Stephen Hawkins did, that his body is going to crap, and yet this thing called mind is brilliantly awake. Or the reverse, mind is shutting down because the karmic forces that put it together are now becoming exhausted, and yet the body is still alive and vital. So the lesson there is the very lesson that you're trying to teach him, that karma works on different principles, different planes, different times, in different ways. So if we begin to examine that state, we can come away with wisdom and understanding through personal experience. If not, then life just becomes a curse. This just becomes something terrible that has happened to him, not understanding, as based on the question Jeff brought up in the beginning, the very forces that are altering the internal atomic nature of his vehicle are karmic forces. And those karmic forces on that level allow for affinity and attraction, or repulsion and dissolution. They allow for harmonious reverberations and resonance, or disharmonious discophony. And that harmony or discophony turns into health or disease in our bodies, in our minds, in our principles. And all of that is karma. So life is teaching him that if his soul, and no doubt it is taking note. Because even at the end of the life, as we are shared within the teachings and in other traditions, the whole life will become flashed before the gaze of the soul as the brain is dying. And the soul will look literally impassionately on every event to see the connecting pieces of the forces that arise from its own being and that carry themselves out life after life through the process of reincarnation. So, I mean, the compassion is there. If they have a question, we can try to help them in that moment. And sometimes it might be good to give up a belief that no longer works. We are only in trouble and seek help when the resources that we typically use no longer work. So if he is at a point where everything he has not given him light, then perhaps the introduction little by little of something else might be very beneficial for him.
Well, thank you. Yes, he does have a situation which is good now, and he has a doctor from Sanford, and so things have changed considerably.
Great.
But that every time I tell him that he is a divine soul, he seems to take comfort, and then a few minutes later he'll start screaming.
Well, the brain screams by habit, the soul
Yeah.
takes note and comfort.
Yeah, I think that what you said is very good. Thank you.
You're
So
welcome.
yeah, let's move on.
Okay, Dave, your hand is up, and then
you were talking about time and karma before. I was thinking, for the most part, time is kind of a linear concept. The way we think of it and use it, past, present, future, and so on and so forth. But it's interesting, Aphorisms 6 says that that karma is not subject to time.
Right.
So my question is, in a sense, what is it subject to?
Okay, number 6.
Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Karma is not subject to time, and therefore, he who knows what is the ultimate division of time in this universe knows karma. And so the question, if it's not subject to karma, if it's not subject to time, what is it subject to? Right. And law is not subject to anything except law.
Okay.
Remember in the Key to Theosophy again, 205, if we accept this literally and we apply the who, what, where, when, how, why, conditionality, relativity, motive, and I-ness, she says, karma is the ultimate, I like to put in the word supreme, universal law, the fountain, the source, and the origin of all other laws.
Okay,
so
I stop you there for 1 second?
Sure.
I wanted to make it more like in the particular sense of where we find ourselves, where we're living. What determines the rolling out of our particular karma in terms of what the first gentleman was talking about, the effect side of things?
Okay, so that's another aphorism.
Okay.
Okay, and so
it's born out of not being subject to time. That's what got me started on it.
Well, there are two. There's that question because karma begins in time and space when the ego incarnates. Remember, when the soul is about to enter into reincarnation, about to enter into life, it has that pre-life vision. The pre-life vision that it is looking at is contained in the mental deposits that Judge talks about in Patanjali's Yoga Aphorisms. Those mental deposits then become the creative seeds. If you think about page 200 in The Secret Doctrine, she gives us the 4 lower planes. The 3 she just leaves for the moment: the archetypal, the creative, the formative, and the physical. The archetypal is similar to the samskaric impressions that the soul is looking at as it's coming into incarnation. The creative force plane then becomes the arousal and the awakening of the creative force of our being into the state of formation, which then drives the DNA process for the physical manifestation. But then the other part of your question has to do with what comes or what determines what deposits, in a sense, are manifesting in what particular life, in what particular environment, in what particular instrument. And Judge has about 4 or 5 aphorisms and instruments. Okay, if we're looking at aphorism 17, 18, 19, 20, they deal with the instrument. The appropriateness of an instrument for the operation of karma consists in the exact connection and relation of the karma with the body, mind, intellectual, and psychic nature acquired. Every instrument used by the ego in any life is appropriate to the karma operating through it. Changes may occur in the instrument through one life so as to make it appropriate for a new class of karma. And then what we have to act, and there is some more, but then we have to now flip our query to the very plane of karmic force itself, which is pre-incarnation. And what you're asking is, how do the karmic deposits and the karmic forces align themselves in order to precipitate out a particular life, a particular instrument, on a particular plane, at a particular cycle, in a particular race, in a particular family, in the particular environmental conditions, with the various resources that are allowed in the particular country that will allow access to those resources or not. And so again, that who, what, where, when, how, why, blah, 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 blah. And each case then, if we're going to do this properly, should be looked at individually. Because now we've got to look at the line of forces. Judge says that karma precipitates through the least resisting line of force. And if we're going to believe what the aphorisms on karma say, karma as an incarnating presence determines the species that we incarnate into, the life experiences that we encounter, and the lifespan that the astral field contains. And in that equation are the affinities that draw it to and push it away from certain experiences that it will encounter in life. So we can talk about that in general, and it's good to talk about the ingredients, but then we would have to apply the ingredients to a particular case.
You uncovered a lot. Thank you. Thank you.
Anthony?
Yes, this just segues very nicely. Aphorism 21. Now, it says that that which man calls mercy and justice, this is in relation to the law of karma, and that mercy and justice are only opposite poles of a single whole, and that mercy without justice is not possible in the operation of karma. So my question is, if man's understanding of mercy and justice is defective, errant, and impure, that doesn't bode well.
Doesn't bode well for who?
For the man, for his lack of understanding of his errant and defective and impure sense of mercy and justice.
Well, let's play with that for a moment. The sage doesn't believe what man believes is just and merciful. So the sage is not bothered by it. The sage sees it, understands it for what it is, and quietly tries to do something about it. Man who's caught up in it will complain about it if he's at the wrong end of it, and will accept it even if he doesn't deserve it, if he's at what's considered the right end of it. And the judgments that we make nowadays are not based on karma. The judgments that we make nowadays are based on power. They're based on sex. They're based on color. They're based on who has and who has not. There is nothing just about that. There is nothing merciful about that. There is no true judgment in that kind of a process. Again, I don't like to talk about racial issues, but I'm sure the majority of you have seen the news that came on within the last 2 days. And it was a classic case of two teenagers fighting, one black, one white. It happens every day, no problem. And yet, for one reason or another, the police had to get involved. The fact that the police had to get involved is not a problem, because if the police are there, they're going to try to break it up. But when you look at, and I have to laugh because if I don't laugh, I'm going to cry.
It was unbelievable.
When you look at the tape, the first person they went to tackle, not to ask to stop, to tackle, was the Black 14, 15-year-old kid. They didn't hold him. They didn't try to restrain him. They took him down. And then you see the more privileged child being put in a chair or sitting down. He put his hands up, put the cuffs on me. I'm part of this too. The police opted not to put the cuffs on him, turned their back on him, which you don't do as a police, and then went to help the other police by putting another knee on the back of this 14-year-old. 2 knees, 200 plus pounds, handcuffs. The kid is Black. That was the only difference. Where is the justice? Where is the mercy? If it was a Korean kid, it would be the same thing. Where is the justice? Where is the mercy? Where is the judgment? And so when we really look at what we do as humans to each other, there is no real mercy there. I mean, look at what I don't understand politics, but look at what Putin is doing to Ukraine. Is that just? Is that merciful? No, none of this is that we engage in and take for granted and watch on the news every day. Monica.
Yes, thank you, Jean. This is just so great. What a great presentation. My concern is aphorism number 26. And it says that the sway of karmic tendency will influence the incarnation of an ego or family of egos for 3 lives at least, when measures of repression, elimination, or counteraction are not adopted. I want to know if I'm understanding this correctly. Is this saying that whatever karma we have to work out in a family, we'll experience it for 3 lives if we don't do anything to change it?
And I'm laughing only because, not at your question, but because of what I was thinking about as you were asking the question. And you know, 3 lives, it may be 30 lives that we experience it if we don't change it.
Oh my God.
You know, I mean, the beauty of this is that it deals with the idea of mitigation. And there are several, I think 2 or 3 aphorisms on mitigation. And basically, when you study Patanjali's yoga aphorisms, he talks about the idea of mitigation, the idea of repression, the idea of suppression, the idea of attenuation of karma. And so there is an equation for, again, the spiritual man, the spiritual woman, the seeker, who would now actively look at the chain of nindanas and use that chain of nindanas to look at where they are now, to look at the past causes that generated that, to look at the possibility of birth if they continue that, and to look at what needs to be done here and now to alter that. And it is not a one-time thing, because it deals with the very modifications of the mind itself, which is what Patanjali starts with. So when we are understanding the modifications of the mind and the positivity and negativity of those, when we are understanding the obstacles, when we are understanding the afflictions, when we are understanding the various levels of dispassion, and when we know where we want to go, and when we know what keeps us in this world, we can begin to use the idea of the nindanas: ignorance, samskaras, consciousness, name and form. Those 4, or let's put it this way, these 3 are pre-time and space. Ignorance, we've been laughing and dealing with forever, unless we make an effort to change it. Samskaras, if we call them the Gunas, and their imbalance are active forces in activity forever. Consciousness is both a cause of samskaras and ignorance, as well as modified by samskaras and ignorance. And then if we think of consciousness as now coming into incarnation as name and form, i.e. consciousness identifying subject and objectivity, experiences, environments, and other differences, then that consciousness experiences planes of incarnation and senses, i.e. instruments for next contact. Once that contact occurs, there is an immediate sensation. We choose to determine whether it is a positive sensation or a negative sensation. If it is a positive sensation, we are attracted to it and glued to it because we're ignorant of what its true nature is. If we perceive it as a negative one, we are attracted to keeping it away, i.e. desire. We desire it or we desire it go away. We can only desire it when we assume the position of an I. I don't like it because it is different from me, and this is the very situation that the world is in today, separateness. And HPB tells us that the closest that we get to it is the idea only, which is why karma, a little segue, is both universal, works distributively, works nationally, works in families, and works individually. But then when we get the contact, the sensation, and we get the clinging, now we don't want anything but pleasure. Now we don't want to avoid anything but pain. Then we are gathering together these skandhas, which differ from the samskaras, to create the form or modify the DNA that allows us to go into a birth, as well as the very environment that we're being born into as it relates to family, and as it relates to racial karma, as well as individual karma that comes in more in play at the age of 7. So when we look at that formula, if we begin to realize, wow, it's my contact, the nature of my consciousness, the infatuation with my senses that generate sensations that I determine that I like or dislike, then we begin to alter that process. When we begin to alter that process, we begin to minimize birth. When we begin to minimize birth because of altering that process, and then turn name and form back into consciousness and examine the samskaras and the gunas and the principles, now we are lessening our ignorance. Eventually, through that process in meditation and living the life, that ignorance becomes a simple non-recognition, but definitely not an externally, I think they call it in India, uthana point of view. It becomes an internal point of view. And eventually that ignorance clears and we begin to see the light. And the light is, as the voice of the silence tells us, radiating from our own true nature. Thou art the light. I think it's the second 2 paths. And so 3 lives if we don't check it. More than 3 lives if we do. The ones that begin to check it begin to become familiar with the process, begin to see the process manifesting before their very eyes, and become more invested in their practice while living life that eradicates the outflow of those karmas. And it's not that it takes them away, but as Judge says in his article, where we place our focus is where the fire of karma burns. And if the fire of karma is predominantly physical and our focus is spiritual, the fuel is consumed but has no spiritual negative impact. And so again, the more that we become familiar with these terms and the more that we see them and use them, the more we begin to take full charge of our own lives, accepting the responsibility for that. And again, takes us back to the quote, for the sage or the spiritual seer, karma is the best friend.
It's about, she wanted to know about.
There was Shoma.
Thank you very much.
She said,
I just need to better understand the term
we don't do something,
instrument.
we're gonna have.
The best way I see it is conditions, appropriate conditions for things to act out the karma. Is that a good way of putting instrument? Does it mean the physical, psychic, mental instrument, literally? Or
Yeah.
okay.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, there are many ways that you can use it, but always should involve the form that the soul is using to contact nature.
Mm.
And so that form can be a sheath, it can be a family, because the family itself can become an instrument through which we're experiencing different things. It can be the body that we use. It can be the sheaths that we awaken along our spiritual path. And if we think about the article, The Elixir of Life, in 5 years of theosophy, if our practice is sincere, then we are literally transforming and transferring our consciousness energy literally to another plane. And once we do that, we begin to create karma on that plane. If we are smart, we will apply the same formula of the nindanas, the modifications, and exercise and dispassion on all levels right then and there. If we do, we avoid the same entrapments on the subtle level, or as Judge would call it, astral intoxication, that we would have on the physical level. And most of us, because we're so outwardly directed, can't get inwardly at all to establish the inner points of consciousness or the sheaths that go along with them. But yes, those would be additional instruments that the true soul or consciousness, not the empirical, outward directed, brain-based sense uses, but the real being that uses the brain, that is sometimes called the astral ego, sometimes called the lower manas, all of which point to different things, but that uses those vehicles. And once we are putting those vehicles in action, we are generating karma.
Thank you.
Yes.
Jeffrey, would it be possible if I asked a question, Jeffrey,
Sure.
and then I think you'll have time to get to you. Is that okay, Jean?
Yeah.
I had a follow through on the last two questions, but to put my question in a nutshell, what's the relationship between 19 and 27? And while you're trying to figure out what my question is, Judge seemed like he was on the lookout really for those who would be helpers of humanity, not just people who wanted to do self-improvement, but people that were kind of like him, so to speak, that wanted to give. And if a person was, and you've been talking about that, this idea of transferring from one plane to the other, and 5 years of theosophy and so forth, and working on oneself, to be honest, for humanity with that kind of motivation, what would be the relationship between 19 and 27?
In the relationship between 19 and 27, and actually I'm going to read them because they're just different aspects of doing the same thing.
Yep.
Changes may occur in the instrument during one life so as to make it appropriate for a new class of karma. And this may take place in two ways: through intensity of thought and the power of a vow, and through natural alterations due to complete exhaustion of causes. Then 27, measures taken by an ego to repress, eliminate defects, and counteract. And again, Patanjali's in terms of attenuate, to repress, to suppress, to destroy sometimes. Those efforts to counteract by setting up different causes will alter the sway. And that was that last question, or the question before, the duration of karma: 3 lives, 4 lives, 5 lives, 1 life. of karmic tendency and shorten its influence in accordance with the strength or weakness of the efforts expended in carrying out the measures adopted. And so if we put these two things together, we're talking about using mind as an instrument, not only to take vows. And whenever I hear that word vow, I always revert back in my own mind to a statement that the teacher said, that without truly taking a vow in their system, none of this becomes really a practical science. It's not that they're not going to give things, but you cannot awaken to things. So taking a vow from the innermost aspect of our being that literally, in a sense, shatters the world to the degree that we often talk about this thing called desire. Just like an adult would no longer desire to sleep in a crib. Similarly, at certain stages when the mind, through these initial techniques, through the taking of a vow, through mitigation of karma, through understanding the line of nindanas as it relates to creating karma, to exercise in dispassion, to literally working on the modifications of the mind, to getting rid of the afflictions, which are ignorance, the ego, the attraction, the avoidance or hatred, and the clinging and the fear, as well as certain others. This becomes one's everyday life in the midst of what they do. The vow is the fire that burns up all of the material things that then, outside of true love, have no value. And that's another thing that the Patanjali Yogas point out, that all things are vexations to the true spiritual sage. It's not that they're trying to retire from the world, but it's just that there is no longer any real affinity between the toys that exist in the world and the truth that they have experienced within themselves in degrees. And once that begins to waken up, once that light begins to break through that darkness, and Judge has another article on that, and I think it's referred to as the beam lights of the sun coming through the clouds. When that process begins and desire is becoming destroyed, just like you can walk into a candy store and not want anything, you can walk on the face of this earth, as JC said, be ye on the earth, but not of the earth. And so these initial interventions, carried to their utmost, really help not destroy the ego, but diminish the egoic my point of view. And so we make a distinction between I am and I-ness. And in the yoga aphorisms, that's a subtle distinction that is also made that some miss. Once we become I am, we have to say, I am not that. I am this. I don't like that. I don't like this. I don't like what I see. I like what I see. But we create that dichotomy. When we are I-ness is presence. There is nothing to like or not like. There is only the depth of understanding that is necessary to see why it is the way that it is. When we understand the way that things are, then like doctors, we can begin to help those that want help in regards to the very things that they think they are trapped in, that in fact they are not. So the actual circles of limitation, just like you look at a child who's having a temper tantrum because they think that there are no other options, and you've got 10 of them, 20 of them. Their circle is this big. Your circle is this big. They can expand. You can contract. You can understand where they are, help them stretch a little bit, and that's what we do with our kids. And yet not be caught up in that circle, because our circle is so much more involved with, for lack of a better word of saying it, reality. And so when we're taking these vows, when we're engaging in literal mitigation. And the Buddhists have a great way of doing that, and they simply call it accumulating merit. But if you're accumulating merit from the point of view of trying to get away from karma, then you're accumulating karma. And so true accumulation of merit occurs when desire is almost dead. And yet when desire dies, because people have clung to it so long, they get depressed. And they misunderstand the absence of desire for depression, and they're ready to kill themselves. And so there's a whole psychology that's wrapped up in there that we need to be really aware of as we're trying to navigate that path. But those two things are very intimately related.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Jeffrey.
Anyone else want to do a question? That was a great question. Thanks so much, Jonathan. It was really wonderful. And I love what you said about vows. You know, Judge wrote about the Pure Land sector. He's one of the first people to write about it in the West, as he did. And he emphasized that the Pure Land, the Sambhoga Kaya, was based on vows. And actually, listening to you, I realized how much my religion, Buddhism, is a religion of vows. No, really, seriously, you know, I mean, I mean, even the lay believers, we can choose just one if we want, but we choose things that we want to give up or attain. And so that was a really, really interesting discussion. I also appreciated, by the way, your, speaking of Buddhism, that you're going over the 12-fold chain of causation. And I want to mention, there's one, Bhikkhu Bodhi, the great translator, wrote an article, Transcendental Dependent Origin. I don't know if you've seen it, but there's one time where the 12-fold chain is interrupted because suffering generates faith, and faith eventually leads to liberation. So that, just want to say, yeah, and that was only one time in the Samyutta that occurs. But
just to interrupt, that's why, in a sense, HPB says, "Woe to those that do not suffer."
But I would add to that, woe to those whose suffering does not lead to faith, or sort of to a new perception.
Right.
You know, because suffering can just lead you down into a further spiral downward. Okay, I had a question going back to the idea of law being coeval with the absolute. What is not law?
If you really ask it the way you ask it, I would simply say nothing.
So there's nothing, there's no adharma, there's no anomos, to use the Greek, in the cosmos.
I mean, if, you know, and again, this is why, you know, it depends on where we start. But if we're starting with law as coeval with deity, law is the very fabric of all substance. Every point in space is law, ready to unfold. HPB expresses that from the third plane when she says on page, I think it's 277, that omniscience exists in every point of space, thrills through every point of space. That is the germ of prajna. Patanjali tells us that the germ of omniscience becomes essentially awoken to its fullness and universal values in the sage that is able to achieve that state. I think that's in book 2, book 1 or book 2. And so law is either what we're experiencing, or just like, and let's put the analogy in the realm of DNA. We know that DNA runs the gamut of the entire physical transformation of forms for our globe. Similarly, there is a point of law that if we would see it unfold, and the Buddha did, we would see law inherent and unfolding through every point in space. both simultaneously, synchronistically, and linearly, depending upon our point of view at the time. And I say that only because I use the analogy in my head that we can turn TV channels. When we turn TV channels, instead of looking at stations, we're looking at planes of activity. And according to the teachings, it's all coadunitional. That means it's all there in one place, although not one substance. And so when our vision is clear enough to see that space, we see all things. And again, depending upon how deeply you go into Patanjali's yoga aphorisms, there are those yogis that experience the unfolding of all things, just like the near-death experience when the swimmer is about to die and their whole life flashes. It occurs in 1 second, and yet it's the whole thing in its unique time and space. And so time then becomes, I'm sorry?
You mean unique to that person?
Yeah, because that's the point of view that is experiencing that state at that time. And again, it brings to mind the same question that, and Lisette is here, that she had asked in Wednesday's class about Devachan, or no, I'm so sorry. She commented on that, and Beryl had asked, why is Devachan apparently so long? Because time doesn't exist in reality as we experience it. And time is a construct that the ego can manipulate. And why is that? Because as Judge tells us, he who knows the ultimate division of time, that only begins on the 4th plane, not the 5th, not the 6th, not the 7th. And remember, the 6th, the 5th, and the 7th, or half of the 5th, is the eternal noumena of our being, the light into which we can look to see all truth. We don't talk about that much, but that is there. It's there in the teachings. And these are things that are available to the individuals that take that vow to live that life, to know that teaching. And so again, it brings us back to the fact that every point in space is law. And when that point expresses itself as in the Big Bang, it is nothing but law. And law guides every unfolding of that point into space and time. And yet, if we transcended space and time, then we would see not only that point, but even many more. And so these are things that rattle the normal way that we think, but nonetheless do not make them not true. And they're not true because they are experientially verifiable. And they're experientially verifiable simply by live the life to know the teaching, or as Judge said, take Patanjali seriously.
But that also is like saying, of course, I'm changing the channel, but that the police incident you described before is an unfoldment of law.
Yes,
of what is just and merciful.
It is, but don't forget that as Judge tells us in the Aphorisms and as we learn in Patanjali, because of succession, because of that empty space in between 2 musical notes, we have choice.
We have what?
We have choice. Mm-hmm. That is the greatest power that we have, and yet we neglect it. Mm-hmm. Because in that moment, we can choose to do or not to do. And again, now you would also appreciate the jhanic unfolding from the Buddhist perspective of how an event hits the bhavanga, which then alters the vibrational nature, the senses touch it, the contact of the senses then alters the vibrational stable state of the senses, and we know this neurologically, and alters the transmission. The transmission then goes into the brain. It's integrated in what Judge refers to as that great germ in the center, but goes through the thalamus. All of that information is integrated into a representation. Then that representation, all in instance, is referred to memory, in order to get a conceptual understanding of what it is in the moment. And then we decide whether we like it or we don't like it. And then we make a judgment what to do about it. Once we make that judgment, we've changed lines because we're going to make that judgment with force because we hate everything like that and we react to it, or we react by habit without even thinking because we've been conditioned. And so when we're talking about those legal events that was just mentioned, or we're talking about civil rights events, or we're talking about world war events, as HPB says, if we don't get past the instinctual nature of our animal forms, we can never create order in entropy. The universe, second law of thermodynamics, entropy in a limited system. They forgot about consciousness, which is anti-entropy. Consciousness orders randomness. And so when we bring consciousness into the process that tends to degrade and break down, i.e. civil unrest, prejudice, judgment, bias, hatred, all of those things that are just randomly destructive and destroy anything that has been put together, then we begin to lift up life. As Judge says, we're lifting up the very elementals of life. And so we're talking science, we're talking metaphysics, we're talking the true path of the soul, and all of this has been laid out as a way to transform the world. If there were only enough of us that could get together to do it by putting aside personal points of view and I am this as opposed to I am not that. But again, it all goes together. There is nothing separate in theosophy.